Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker this morning, Doug Ladd, who many of you know and many of you recommended that we consider for a plenary speaker today. You've heard him speak before. He always has an interesting, good message to deliver to us. We made it possible for you to log on to his resume online if you wanted to read it, so I won't read the whole thing for you. But I will make a few comments about his background for those of you who aren't as familiar with Doug. He's been involved in conservation for over 35 years, and he's been director of the conservation for the Missouri Nature Conservancy chapter for many of those years. And he's quite well known throughout the United States as an accomplished conservation biologist and a botanist. He's been involved heavily with fire management. In fact, I think that's where I first heard about Doug Ladd, when Pauline Drobny went down to serve on his fire crew many, many years ago, and related events from that. But he's also been involved in fire ecology, conservation planning, natural areas assessment, and ecological management, and restoration and research with a particular emphasis on vegetation, ecological restoration, and fire ecology. His recent work has been more concentrated on vegetation and fire ecology of the Midwestern prairies and woodlands, developing assessment and ecological monitoring protocols for terrestrial vegetation and ecoregion conservation planning. He's a certified fire boss and instructed in fire training courses in the United States and Central America. In addition to numerous articles and reports, he's the author of 2 plant field guides, at least one I'm sure you've used quite a lot. One's the North Woods Wildflowers, and the other's the Tallgrass Prairie Wildflowers, which I frequently see on field trips. And he's co-author of Discover Natural Missouri and Distribution of Illinois Vascular Plants. So with a little bit of that background, Doug talking to us about what is prairie.
Thank you, Darrell. Despite all that laudatory introduction, I know the real reason why I'm here. These conferences need an opening speaker, someone usually long in the tooth from far away, so you can say, wow, we're doing it better than that. The other reason you want an opening speaker is someone who can sort of fill time before the real rock stars come on, kind of like an opening act at a concert, so people can drift in late and eat their coffee and stuff. So I'm under no illusions. Nonetheless, I'm honored to be here. I was thinking on the longer than I thought, drive up last night. There's an immense amount of our thinking about tallgrass prairies and what we know about them and their conservation that has really come from people in Iowa. And I was just thinking some of the names of people that have been so influential even beyond Iowa. Darrell mentioned Pauline Drobny, Carl Kurtz, Darrell himself, John Pearson, Dean Russa, Tom Rosberg, all these people, on and on and on, who have shaped the way we think about, manage, and understand our prairies. And then we think about Iowa's fantastic heritage of prairie landowners, or prairie-associated landscape landowners, who have made stunning commitments to manage and conserve the prairie heritage here. And I think of Diane and Bill Blankenship, or Sibella and Bill Brown, and Iowa has a heritage of that that's unmatched. And then you add to that the prairie managers who have really forged the science of applied prairie ecology and management, the Scott Motzes and the Mel Moes. Iowa's got an astounding legacy of prairie heritage. And who am I to stand up here and talk to you about prairies? I mean, you know the game in Iowa better than I do. But what I do think is, at times, we need to think about our concepts and recalibrate our thinking about prairies. So what I'm going to talk about is an adaptation of something, a similar talk I gave at the Missouri Botanical Congress this year. It got me thinking, and I've developed it a little. Take it for what it's worth. But what I'd like to talk about a little is the history, the genesis of our prairie landscapes, and what that means in terms of how we manage them and how we interact with them in a contemporary environment. And I think we're hostage to 2 things as human beings. It's just hardwired into us. One is, we always want definitive answers. We like to compartmentalize, and I'm going to discuss in a little bit how sometimes I think that can be counterproductive. What I think is more dangerous to us, and we always have to work against it, is we're always immersed in the present. We are beings of the present. And so we get hit by what I call temporal chauvinism. We think, now we finally got it right. Everyone else we've learned from has taught us, and now we've got it right. And that does two things. We don't pay enough attention to the past, either biologically or culturally, and also we don't build in the uncertainty of understanding that we haven't got it right, no more than people 30 years ago had it right. We're part of an iterative process. And when we think about the way we interact with our ecological systems upon which we all ultimately depend, we have to build that uncertainty into the process. 30 years from now at an Iowa Prairie Conference, when someone stands up here and yaks at you, some of the things we think now are going to be wrong or going to be altered in the way we apply them. So we have to accommodate that fact that we haven't got it right. We're part of a process as we move forward. So my talk is entitled, What is a Prairie? But it could also have been entitled, Old Player's New Game. If you, that was the title I figured also potentially. We're going to talk, Daryl, I wanted to go back 4 billion years in time and cover the whole history of life on Earth, culminating in the tallgrass prairie. I told Daryl we could do it in one long day. If we only took 10 minutes for lunch, he wouldn't let me do that. So we're going to fast forward to 65 million years ago. And you're thinking, what does this have to do with me? Well, it's partly just kind of interesting stuff. And it's partly, I think, places the prairie in context and help us to understand it as the evolutionary processes that shape and form the species that comprise our prairies are really the ultimate definer of how we can sustain our prairies. When we're sustaining prairies, we're sustaining evolutionary processes. 65 million years ago, last Tuesday, Earth had a very bad day. There was a piece of cosmic dust that had been flying through the air for who knows how many billions of years, less than 3 miles across, and it smacked into North America that day. And if it had just come straight down and plunked into the planet, it would have been bad, but it did the worst possible thing. It came streaking in from the southeast across what is now Florida and plunged into what is now the Gulf of Mexico, which was a shallow coastal sea at a very shallow angle, about 50,000 miles an hour. And instantly, we almost lost all life on Earth. It almost extirpated life on the planet. That one event, that 3-mile chunk of space dust plowing in at a very shallow angle, instantly created a crater 100 miles across, 3 miles deep. Temperature for an instantaneous fraction of a second was higher than the surface temperature of the sun. The energy release was astounding. Every standing woody plant in what is now North America was flattened instantly. There was a lot more oxygen in the air at that time. There were catastrophic fires. The amount of particulate matter ejected from that impact had ramifications for thousands of years or centuries afterwards in the Earth's climate. The reason it's important is because at that point in time, and by the way, when that happened, no animal, no terrestrial animal with a body weight over 20 kilograms in maturity survived in the entire New World. Only things that could hide in crevices and stuff did. Almost all life in the New World was wiped out, and the ramifications happened around the planet. And something profound happened from that impact and the climatic effects that happened afterwards, and that was the dinosaurs became extinct. And that led to something that is very profound and thinking part of our prairies, and that was the dinosaurs had been the dominant life form on Earth at that time, the animal life form. But there were mammals around. They were small, scurrying, rodent-like things, more like politicians than the mammals we see today. But they were mammals. But when the dinosaurs were gone, there was a vast array of niches available to them, and life radiated and re-radiated, and speciation occurred at accelerated rates into all kinds of new niches, and mammals radiated outward and filled all kinds of niches. Mammals started flying, mammals developed fish-like characteristics and lived their entire life in marine ecosystems, and mammals became browsers and grazers. And sometime before that, something else profound had happened in the angiosperm world, and that is the early primitive plants tended to have what we call apical meristems. So something comes along and munches off a tip and it stops growing. A lot of our plants still have that. But there developed a group of plants with basal meristematic tissues, adapted to the kinds of things the new browsing and grazing mammals were doing. They get munched off, they grow back. So we have almost this synergy developing between these more sophisticated angiosperms with basal meristematic tissues and a growing suite of developing mammals that graze or browse. So the stage was set. And then 57 million years ago, grasses came into what is now North America. And if I'd given this talk 2 months ago, I would have talked about grasses being relatively new in age at that time. But talking about how we never get it just right, in the last couple of months, there's been a profound discovery from Asia, finding fossilized grasses in Asia, in amber, that are more than 100 million years old. So if this holds up, grasses are far older in our evolutionary lineage than we thought. Be that as it may, grasses arrived in North America 57 million years ago or so. And the first grasses were very primitive bamboo-like things. For millions and millions of years, they tended to be critters of shaded, wet areas in woodlands. And only relatively recently have grasses then suddenly radiated and speciated into a whole bunch of drought-adapted species and the open land species we see today. But it's been a profound influence. 20% of the world today, the natural vegetation cover is grassland. Why? Because they're adapted to a special suite of conditions that other vegetation can't handle. You all know this. They tend to flourish in areas where woody vegetation cannot because of temperature or drought or nutrient limitations or other factors such as that. And even more recently than 57 million years ago, about 30 million years ago, some of these grasses developed an improved photosynthetic pathway, what we call C4 photosynthesis. It's just a way that there's an extra step where they attach the carbon atom to a 4-carbon molecule, hence it's called C4. Often you hear people say, well, C4 photosynthesis is more efficient than C3. That's really not true. It's actually 40%, it takes 40% more energy to fix a carbon atom with C4 photosynthesis. But what C4 photosynthesis does is it allows plants to flourish in dry or hot or nitrogen-limited environments. And think about our prairie landscapes. Often dry, not today, but often dry, often hot, and often nutrient-limited. So C4 plants have played a disproportionate role in the thinking about our prairie ecosystems. And see, the physiological pathway of C4 photosynthesis is not unique to grasses. It apparently evolved independently in a bunch of plants over time. About 3% of the world's plants are C4 plants, but 46% of the 10,000 species of grasses on Earth are C4, telling you how well that ecological adaptation suits them for the grassland environment. So the stage is set again with a suite of grasses and related species and broadleaf plants with similar adaptations that can handle that system. And then something profound happens about 5 to 7 million years ago. For the past 40 million years before that, there's been one of the longest, most stable vegetation types on Earth. The North American continent is dominated by this deciduous, broad-leaved Arctotertiary forest for 40 million years. If you're a botanist, it's pretty boring because there's not a lot of change. But there weren't many botanists then. But starting about 5 to 7 million years ago, we get the warmest period in the Tertiary. And it gets drier and warmer. And there's these grasses, remember, that are in the landscape, and they're starting to develop and speciate rapidly. And we have, by 2 million years ago, extensive grasslands with high form diversity in North America. Essentially our first prairies. Nothing like the prairies we see today, totally different influences, but our first broadly open grasslands. So that's why we talk about old players, new game. Because of the species, with one exception, comprising our grasslands, are old species. So we had the first real history of an extensive grassland landscape in the North American continent, setting the stage by the evolution and genesis of all these species of plants and associated animals that comprise our prairie heritage. Now let's fast forward to starting about 2 million years ago, also the Earth entered what I called its obsession with ice dancing. And what we had is glaciers coming and going in the new and old worlds, back and forth and back and forth. Back in the dark ages, when I went to college, and we didn't even know plants had DNA, we were taught that there were 4 distinct glacial periods in the last 2 million years. And the oldest was the Nebraskan, and then the Kansan, and then the Illinoisan, and then the Wisconsin. The reality as we now know it is, there was a much more complicated series of glacial and interglacial intervals of varying spatial content across the North American continent. But basically, there were 2 million years of ice coming and going, coming and going. And then about 15,000 years ago, we had the last glacial maximum. And where we're sitting now was under a mile-thick sheet of ice, a part of the Des Moines lobe of the Wisconsin glaciation. 15,000 years ago, there was nothing here biologically. Scott's smiling because he thinks I'm going to make a crack about how culturally it was the same in Des Moines as today. But I'm not going to say that because I'm in Iowa. But the point is, the biological systems you're charged with restoring and managing and sustaining through time with all their inherent biodiversity are new systems. 15,000 years in biological time is a blink like that. And something else profound happened as that ice started retreating by fits and stages in 15,000 years ago, and the modern climate cycle within a more close to what we see today in terms of its range of dynamism. Something else happened, and that is the first humans came into the North American landscape. We know that there's been a continuous occupancy of humans in Midwestern North America for at least 14,000 years. There's some tantalizing anecdotal evidence that it might be much longer, but we don't know that. But people have been interacting with the biological systems here since the glaciers retreated and our modern biological systems came into being. And one of our challenges, I think, in conservation is to convince people that there's not this false dichotomy we've created in our philosophy of people and nature. People are embedded in and a part of nature. And here in the Midwest, more than anywhere else I know of on Earth, it's fundamental. Ever since the glaciers left, people have been here, managing the land according to their needs and abilities. Our tallgrass prairies are human-mediated ecosystems. Obviously, it doesn't mean that all human influence is good, but what it does mean is people have been a part of the equation forever. And we're at a pivotal point now for conservation, as everyone in this room knows. For the first time in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, one species, humans, has the ability, for better or worse, to sustain or extinguish entire biological systems. We have finally reached the point where we're technologically sophisticated enough we can obliterate or sustain our biological systems. That's never happened before. I mean, 14,000 years ago, when the first humans came into the landscape, they had a profound effect on it. And as I said, they managed it according to their needs and abilities, but they didn't have the technological sophistication to wreak the havoc we are capable of doing. And what did those early peoples do? Well, they managed the landscape to sustain themselves, and the fact that they not only survived here in the Iowa landscape and were largely non-nomadic, I mean, they were here in Iowa year-round. The fact that they survived despite the winters and all the other harshness of living here without, energy inputs or commodity inputs from elsewhere tells you they were extremely sophisticated at adapting the land to their needs and adapting to the land. And the fact that they not only survived, but they developed art and mythology and lore and all the other cultural accoutrements of a sophisticated society tells you that they were existing above subsistence levels. And we know, and I'm not telling anyone here anything new, we know one of the most profound tools in those pre-bulldozer days that the native peoples had available to them was what the Plains Indians called the red bison, fire. And we know that if you were a Native American in Iowa 5,000 years ago, it would have been like being a voter in Chicago today, where they vote early and vote often. You would burn early and burn often. And we know from anthropological and from biological data now that Native Americans use fire pervasively, deliberately, as a cultural practice to manage the landscape to suit their needs as a culture. And we could go on and debate the hows and whys and whats of it, but I would submit that we as biologists and conservationists are still underestimating the profound role of Native American fire in sustaining and shaping our natural systems. It's true, there were a few, in this part of the world, there's a few wildfires set by lightning, but most of the lightning here is correlated with, most of the air-to-ground lightning in the Midwest is correlated with significant precipitation, reducing the chance of an ignition event. Most of it happens during the growing season, when the fuels are green and humidities at night are high, so even when a fire starts, rates of spread are slow, and you often hit moisture extinction at night and it goes out. So yeah, there were some, quote, natural fires, but the fire regime that shaped and maintained our prairies and prairie-associated landscapes was aboriginal. It was prevailingly dormant season, low intensity. If you were a Native American living on the University of Northern Iowa campus 500 years ago, in the fall, the tall grass landscape around you after the first killing frost would become dry and brown, and you would have two choices. You could either burn or not burn. That's all your culture had as a choice. If you burn, you could control the fire to protect your encampment and your inhabitants, and the fire would go where it would and do a lot of things, among them reducing wildfire danger. You would eliminate the chance of an accident or a hostile action, sending a fire down on your people where you couldn't escape it. You would sustain the greenery in the land in the late fall green up for hunting. You would manage to sustain certain plants that culturally you were seeking, that you use for food or fiber or medicine or other things. So for all these reasons, we know now that Native Americans, and this is a worldwide thing, this isn't just a Midwestern thing, as Stephen Pine, the guru of World Fire, in his book World Fire said, anywhere there's a dry period and the vegetation becomes flammable and there's an aboriginal human population, there's a deliberate aboriginal fire pattern. It's just hardwired into our genes, because if we don't burn, we engage in lots of risk but no corresponding gain. So these are human fire-managed landscapes we inherited when we settled the land here. The other thing, about 10,000 years ago, the prevailing air masses became Pacific and dry, and we entered a period of about 8,000 years of what we call the hypsothermal, when it was very dry anyways, tended to favor grasslands over woodlands. So the prairies radiated throughout North America, and the eastern tallgrass prairie radiated into North Carolina, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and all these other places. We know that the Mississippi River is not a good fire barrier, because in the 1600s, Father Hennepin noted a fire that was racing across the west shore of the Mississippi River in a high windy night, and the embers crossed the river and spread eastward from there. But the Atlantic Ocean was a good fire barrier. So once the prairies hit Massachusetts, they never got to Europe. But the point being, we live in a grassland biome, and no one more than here in Iowa. You are the center of the tallgrass biome. And the other take home from that is, we've got to stop thinking about prairies as these compartments that existed in a universe apart from the rest of the landscape. I'm frankly rather appalled when and there are several proponents of this in Iowa, I hope none in the room, that Iowa had lots of forests. Iowa didn't have forests. You might have had some very teeny areas of forest along some of your river bottoms or on some of your algific wet talus slopes. You had woodlands that were suffused with prairie biogeographic influences around them. The Midwest is a grassland biome. Sure, some of those so-called prairie landscapes had lots of trees stuck in them, but they were influenced by frequent aboriginal fire regimes, no less than the prairies. Fire behavior was different because of lower productivity, so you had different fires, but they were still affected by fire. So you had this continuum that must have been magnificent in the Iowa landscape. At the close of the hypsothermal, you had an area that was just dominated by these incredibly diverse tallgrass prairies with more than 1,000 different species of flowering plants, untold numbers of invertebrates and everything, and mixed in with them varying degrees of grassland-influenced wetlands and woodlands, but all strongly prairie-affiliated in their biogeographic affinity. Our woodland world, our wetland world, our swamps, if you look at the plants and animals and their biogeographic heritage, they're really a tallgrass legacy. And we've created forests largely through our fire suppression and our compartmentalization. When we see open grasslands, we tended to say, oh, well, we'll manage that as a grassland. We see a few trees, we say, okay, we'll manage that as a forest. And then we suppress fires, and it grows up more and more dense. And the other problem we're all victimized by is ecologists weren't considered socially acceptable enough to come over on the Mayflower. So by the time the first ecologists landed in eastern North America, you've been looking at a landscape that has over 100 years of Native American and Native American fire displacement. And it's all grown up in the scrubby, overgrown woods, and people say, oh, forest, that's what should be here. And that mantra has come westward with settlers, and that pervades our thinking in all of North America today. The only person to really get into this was Stephen Pine again, who said North Americans didn't know what the original landscape looked like because the Native Americans had been displaced too long before the first scientists got there. So he went to Lisbon and Madrid and looked at the logbooks of the fishing boat captains prior to essentially the significant European settlement, and he looked at their accounts when they landed for wood or water or to dry fish. And he gets accounts like Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, an endless plain of tall grasses devoid of firewood because the savages burn this land as often as they can. If you've ever been to Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island now, that's the archetypical New England mixed forest. So it tells you how profoundly the landscape has changed. Again, an example of temporal chauvinism. We're no less bad at it here in interpreting what we see now and trying to think about what that meant for our pre-settlement systems. I don't have any answers, but I really think we need to think much more open-mindedly about what is the landscape around us. The other thing I think we need to think about, we tend to love compartmentalization, ecologists more than anyone. And so we have this idea of what an archetypical tallgrass prairie looks like. And I think if we're going to succeed as a culture and play to some of the things Jim talked about in his opening address, we need to think about what the Greeks called the genius loci, or the spirit of the place. That is the recognition that every acre of the Earth's surface is unique and is unlike any other acre of the Earth's surface. So tallgrass prairie is not tallgrass prairie an entity. It's an incredible diversity of tallgrass prairie systems, each subtly unlike the other, varying tremendously. So that in 900 AD, an acre of tallgrass prairie here would have looked nothing like an acre of tallgrass prairie in Des Moines, or even in Waterloo. There'd be subtle influences based on thousands of years of plants adapting to and being selected for the specific vagaries of that site, moisture and substrate type and soil type and fire regime and climate and all those things playing out in this subtle tapestry across the landscape. So we have to be very careful when we, who are charged with restoring and curating the last precious remnants, when we think about how we manage these systems. We cannot manage for some preconceived paradigm. I think we have to be much more open-minded and say, let's try to attune ourselves to the site conditions and the process regimes that shaped and sustained this biota before we displaced the Native Americans. And let's try to emulate those to play to the genetic memory of the biological diversity that's there, and let's let the system tell us by its response how it's performing. Otherwise, we risk an overly rigid conceptualization where we drive a bunch of systems towards a common paradigm that may or may not be relevant in ecological reality. So I think that's something we need to be very careful about. I think that's something that inherently we have a discomfort with because we like classification and knowns. But there is a uniquity in the landscape that we should celebrate. The people of Waterloo should celebrate when they do prairie restoration that their tallgrass prairie is unlike any other tallgrass prairie on Earth. And of course, we all know in this room that tallgrass prairie itself is the rarest phase of the least protected biological system on the face of the Earth. Far more endangered and unconserved than any tropical ecosystem, endangered as though they be. So you're working with the rarest of the rare. And we have an obligation to sustain it for humanity, because if we lose it here, we're going to lose it for all time. So that brings us up to the end of the hypsothermal. Then it gets cooler, and for the last 3,000 years it's been getting cooler and wetter. Had there been no Native Americans here, Iowa would have been a mixed deciduous forest. But so profound is the human influence that even in the face of a climate that can sustain woodland and forest development, Iowa and Illinois and all the other Midwestern states in the heart of the tallgrass prairie biome sustained themselves as prairie. Aboriginal human impacts swamped the climate change effects. So that the prairie here is really an artifact, more than any other biological system I can think of. It's an artifact of human interaction. I think that's great. People who philosophically have this idea of a utopian nature hate it because it's like it's sullied nature. But I think it's great because it serves to reconnect people with nature at a very fundamental level. There's some opportunity there. We talk about moving conservation forward successfully. One other thing I just want to talk about in that little history trace here is, I talked about one new player in the species landscape for our prairie systems. If you go back about 5 million years ago in Europe and the steppes of Asia, biologically the first mammals there was the first divergence of what became cattle and what became bison. That lineage diverted. And we had the evolution eventually of the steppe bison, Bison praestus. And that went on to evolve into the European bison, the bison of Europe. But our bison then, on their way to when the steppe bison came across the Bering Strait, somewhere along the way, they found some sexy yaks and had some sort of wild party and became intergressed with yak genes. It must have been an interesting event. And then so the steppe bison that came into the New World also had yak genetic presence. And they radiated across central North America into those grasslands that have been formed by aboriginal influences in the hypsothermal. And we had this amazing bison here. And it persisted till about 5,000 years ago. Even as other bison evolved from it. We had the longhorn bison evolved from the steppe bison. It didn't last as long, and it became extinct about 30,000 years ago. We had two other species of bison evolved. All those bison were interesting because they were sexually dimorphic. They tended to have large horns. Their heads were held erect. They lived as solitary animals. And then about 13,000 years ago, another bison comes into the picture. And that's our modern bison, bison. Very different. Head held low to the ground, horns small, sexually, no more extreme morphological characteristics between the males and females. All adaptations for dense herding behavior. Herding behavior has a lot of negatives in it. There's diseases and food availability and all kinds of problems. There's one thing herding behavior gets you, and that is herding behavior is a survival mechanism from intense hunting pressure. And you think about it. For 500,000 years, since the first steppe bison came into the North American continent, there were incredible predators here. I mean, this was like a horror movie. You can make a horror movie on the prehistoric megafauna of the North American plains and prairies. You know, dire wolves and saber-toothed tigers and short-faced bears, and even for a while a bird that was big enough to strike prey as big as us on the run and eat us. All of that was there, and yet those bison remained solitary animals. What created the evolutionary stress that extirpated the 4 bison and pushed that one herd-related bison? Human hunting pressure. So not only have we overtly influenced the prairie landscape through our fire practices of our ancestors, we have indirectly influenced by creating a new bison species that's the ultimate browser on our prairies now. I find that, again, a profound indication of human grassland interactions. It's sort of a poster child, and no one talks about it much. But all evidence points to the fact, and Tim Flannery, the paleobiologist, has written about this extensively. If you ever get a chance to read his book, The Eternal Frontier, it's just an amazing read about the early North American landscape. But he talks about this in some detail. But bison, our modern bison, is almost certainly a human-created species. The very first genetic engineering, 15,000 years ago, or 14,000 years ago. So we have these prairie systems. All of these pressures, as you all know, create a landscape with a high diversity, some of the highest diversities in the temperate world, of deep-rooted, largely perennial, basally meristematic plants that are adapted to searing droughts or being munched off or burned off at any given point in the year, and they can come back. That's the landscape we're dealing with. And these prairies were the victim of their own success. About a third of the roots of a given perennial plant die in a year. Those dead roots then turn into organic carbon, which creates high soil till. So over thousands of years, these deep-rooted perennial plants that make up our prairies created the fertile soils that caused their demise and creating the breadbasket of the world. And we are now charged with sustaining the remnants that are left if we're going to succeed as a people. So we know we're dealing with fire-adapted, deep-rooted, largely perennial-dominated systems. We know these systems had some level of grazing or browsing from large-scale native grazers and browsers, elk and bison. And we know they existed in a largely continuous matrix. Sometimes they were prairie-affiliated grasslands and wetlands, but across the Iowa landscape, as you all know, Iowa more than any other state is a tall grass prairie state. 300 years ago, this comes to the abrupt end with European settlement, boom. And our biological systems are still reeling. Just 300 years ago, really, the first profound European impacts to the North American continent started. Even more recently in Iowa, as far as I know, someone correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, the first European to set sight on Iowa was Marquette and Joliet in late May or early June of 1673 when they floated down the Mississippi River. So, biologically, 1673 to today is nothing. It's less than a generation for some long-lived species. And look how much we've transformed the landscape. Not only have we totally changed the process regimes and the land cover types, we've brought over, either intentionally or unintentionally, a whole suite of plants and animals specially adapted to the kinds of things our society does to the landscape. And our native systems are still reeling. So we as prairie managers then, we know how our prairies evolved. I think it's important to think about the factors that shape them because their evolutionary history is critical to understanding how they function and how we can sustain them. But it ain't 1500 or 900 AD anymore. And we have to recognize the fact that once upon a time, if you went back in time and brought a bulldozer into the middle of the Iowa prairie 1,000 years ago and bulldozed 100 acres, it would come back as prairie. It might take a while, but there's nothing else you could do. Those days are gone. There's a whole suite of camp followers, plants and animals, ready to preempt that successional pattern. And what that means is, not only is there a uniquity that each of our remnants in our existing prairies is unique in itself, it's irreplaceable. We do not have the technology today to replace any of these landscapes if they're lost, and that ought to scare us. Prairie restoration technology is getting ever better. You guys are on the cutting edge of it. The whole Midwest learns from the things that are going on up here. I mean, you set the stage with your roadside vegetation management and your linkages and stuff. But still, once we lose a prairie, we cannot bring it back. We can bring back some semblance of it. We can provide some biological and ecosystem services, some diversity, but no one has ever restored anything approaching the full diversity of a tall grass prairie. So first and foremost, as managers, given what I've just yacked about all this time, we need to think about an ecological Hippocratic oath where we do no harm to our existing prairies because they're irreplaceable. And we have small remnants, we have larger prairie landscapes. Often the larger prairie landscapes don't have the per unit area diversity of the small remnants. Both are essential to sustaining the biological integrity of our prairie heritage. We can sustain all the small pieces in the world in eastern Iowa. That's not going to help at all for the watershed quality or the biological character of western Iowa. So we need to sustain the remnants we have. We need to recognize that it includes both small remnants and large scale. Anywhere where we have the luxury of large scale systems, we have better chance of ultimate success, better management, less intensive, less expensive management. Our remnants and our landscapes as they exist now are in themselves insufficient to sustain our prairie heritage. So we also have to aggressively work to restore and reconnect existing remnants in a landscape that makes sense from a biological point of view. Thinking at the scale of whatever organism we're thinking about, leaf hoppers, grassland birds, mammals, whatever, seed dispersion in plants. We need to think about reconnection. We can't say, oh, we're doing a great job on our management of our remnants, so we're going to sustain it for future generations. Remember the history, the large scale of the grassland landscape, how it's suffused every aspect of Iowa. We have to think about reconnection. And in doing so, we can provide profound services in terms of stormwater runoff, watershed infiltration, groundwater recharge, soil health, pollinator services, and all kinds of other things. So that there's a benefit to society that accrues beyond the prairies themselves as well. But we need to think about that when we think about how we're going to sustain our prairies. And I want to touch a little about grazing in prairies, because at least in my part of the world, that's become a very hot topic. There's a thinking that, oh, bison were here, so prairies should be grazed. I was frankly resistant to that for years. But some of our data from ungrazed, highly well-managed prairies have led me to the conclusion that, yes, some sort of grazing emulation or grazing is necessary to sustain the full diversity and health of a tallgrass prairie. But I'm profoundly troubled by the fact that almost all our grazing paradigms are derived from production agriculture, which probably has nothing to do with the way the prairies were grazed originally. From what we know of the bison and the other grazers and browsers, grazing in prairie landscapes tended to be highly episodic, was probably not even close to annual, and would have resulted in sometimes high levels of forage removal, sometimes not. But when it did, remember, there was nothing else that could come in and preempt that disturbed landscape but prairie plants. It's not that world anymore. So when we apply grazing or similar disturbances to the prairie landscape, we need to always think about it from the perspective of the prairie biota. And we cannot even begin to think about production paradigms in high quality prairies. So I think we need to think about grassland grazing as a bifurcate model, if you will. We talk about existing high quality, high diversity prairie landscapes. Grazing is applied there only to sustain and manage the high diversity of species there, and we grade our success by the response of those species. And in the production landscape, we work to provide native species as linkages and defragmentation corridors and everything else, and incorporate them in production agriculture, but we don't ever confuse the two. And all too often we talk about one model of grazing, and it shouldn't be that way. I think there's tremendous potential, and I think there's some speakers later that are going to address this in a very sophisticated way. There's tremendous potential for incorporation of our native prairie biodiversity in production agricultural mechanisms, and in doing so, we're going to gain both biologically and as a society and economically. But we can't confuse that with grazing as it's applied to high-quality prairies. And I don't know if it suffuses the Iowa lexicon at all. West of us in Missouri, and it's pervaded some Missouri thinking, you hear people talking about calendar prairies now. Like, if you don't accommodate, if you're celebrating these high biodiversity, floristically beautiful prairies, well, those are calendar prairies. I find that astounding because I've never heard anyone ever talk about a calendar forest or a calendar swamp. Hey, it's a degraded forest or a degraded swamp. But when we degrade the prairie, well, that was just a calendar prairie. We have to be very careful about that and make sure what we do as managers and as conservationists sustains the full array of that wondrous biodiversity that really makes our prairie environment. And one thing I want to touch on about that, we talk about that biodiversity, but we don't know it. I'm astounded. I mean, it's astounded me for 30 years. Here we are in one of the richest nations on earth, and we can't even make a list of the species present in a single acre of Iowa prairie. We can't even name what's present there. If Barack Obama walked in this room today, getting sick of the Iran deal, and he wanted to sit in and listen about prairie, and he said, I'll give you guys $2 billion to give an exhaustive list of the biota of the tallgrass prairie. We don't have the technology to do it yet. And yet we are telling people, we're telling donors and taxpayers, give us your money and we'll manage your prairies. That's kind of like your car mechanic. You go in with a broken car and he says, you know, I don't know the names of all the parts in this car, but give me your money and I'll fix it for you. That's what we as prairie managers are saying to people. I don't think this should hold us hostage to action, but I think this needs to make us very humble. We don't know the pieces of the puzzle yet, much less all their complicated interactions. And every bit we learn continues to astound us. The interrelations between plants and animals, between plants and ectomycorrhizal fungi. It's like a fairy tale that's so complicated and interdependent. There's lifetimes of work still studying it. So as I said, it shouldn't make us not do things, but it should make us humble enough to know that we're going to make mistakes, we're going to learn as we go, and we ought to build both uncertainty and the ability to learn from what we're doing into what we do. And that means biological monitoring as part of it. And that means a strong history of human interaction with the landscape at a very fundamental level. We need people who know the behavior and the traits and the characteristics of our plants and our insects and our underground critters and our birds and everything. And yet organismal biology is dying worldwide as a discipline and increasingly being seen only outside of the academic world because grant money and prestige and stuff flow to the gene jockeys. So you are the curators of a precious legacy because only those of us who are deeply immersed day to day to day developed a long experience and repertoire of understanding of how these things work. And we have an obligation to make sure that that cultural legacy is passed on to others. And we're only going to succeed in this if we can develop that knowledge, suffuse that knowledge into the culture, and really get prairies beyond the concept of, oh, we need to conserve them because they're rare or because they're part of what used to be. That's part of it, but we have failed as a discipline in really making the world understand why prairies are important. I've failed as more than I've written about it extensively and it doesn't seem to work, or it hasn't worked fully yet. But the thing is, it's only going to work if the people of Waterloo, if the people of Cedar Falls understand and take immense pride that, yeah, this is a prairie city. I'm in the heart of the tall grass landscape here. And we educate our children a little about it. And so everyone understands, just as much as they understand the cultural accoutrements of Cedar Falls, they understand the tall grass heritage, why it's important to them pragmatically, philosophically, and culturally. We've got to get better at that. And part of it involves re-immersing people into nature. And some of you probably read Richard Love's book, Last Child in the Woods, and he talks about, how important it is to reconnect people with nature. I don't doubt that. But at the same time, there's got to be something more than that, because my generation was supposedly that last idyllic generation that halcyon days and we were allowed to run around outdoors and do everything we wanted. And yet we're responsible for the most destructive epic of landscape clearing in the history of the world. So it's more than just turning people loose in the outdoors. It has to come with a sensitivity and a sense of cultural responsibility as we build it forward. So, in conclusion, I'd say the contemporary reality is this. We know a lot about the genesis and the evolutionary history of the species that comprise our prairie. It's wondrous, it's exciting. We know how these prairies came into being. We have, despite the destruction that has occurred in the last 200 years, we have a significant remnant of tallgrass prairie legacy to curate and restore and use to rebuild a better world. And that is going to happen it has to happen on two fronts simultaneously. One, the applied management and scientific and knowledge generation front, where we restore and curate our remnants, we link them, we build our restoration technology and knowledge, and we manage the landscape that way for both pragmatic and philosophical and biodiversity reasons. And secondly, we make people aware that they are totally dependent on these systems for their quality of life, for the quality of the water, for the flood control, that these systems are inextricably linked to the human fiber just as much as they were 14,000 years ago. Now, 14,000 years ago was a much more explicit linkage because you did something wrong to the landscape you were dependent on, you suffered. Today we have deferred accountability. If we screw up here, we can bring resources or goods in from further away and we pay the piper down the road. But the dependency is still there. It's just not as evident in the landscape. So moving forward, I think we need to be humble in our understanding, but aggressive in our action. We need to be much better communicators at reaching out to atypical constituencies to really unite everyone in an understanding and a cultural pride in what our tallgrass legacy is. And nowhere, as I've said, more than Iowa. You've been the leaders in thinking about prairie conservation for decades now, but that's going to become more and more critical as we ramp it up and really start to reconnect it with the fabric of everyday life. And I really believe we as a people are going to be judged at the end of the day by the degree to which we pass on to our grandchildren and their grandchildren a legacy of this rich and wondrous diversity that makes it unlike any other place in the world. So that's my thinking about the prairie landscape and some ideas about how we might manage it. Thank you very much.